Today we're going to pick up our whirlwind review of apologetics with debunking evolution. And we're going to go through two, so this is going to be fast. We're going to go through the macro evolution part, and then we're going to go through micro evolution. So, remember, we're centering on this because it is something that's claimed to be undisputed fact. And our question is that really the case? So before we dive in, let's talk just a minute about why this is important. This is what we're up against. According to Creation Ministries US, 62% of Americans believe in human evolution. 53% of Christians believe in evolution. 70% of Christian youth believe that science and religion are often in conflict. And half of church-going U.S. teens say that the church rejects much of what science tells us. So that's what we're up against. And these statistics, while they're stunning, they're especially stunning in light of what you're going to see today. Because evolution, whatever it is, it's not science. So our first question is, why do otherwise intelligent people believe in evolution? Answer, the fear of the Lord, or the lack of it. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. In other words, fearing God is the kindergarten of knowledge. You must first fear God if you want to have wisdom. In Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar was punished by God. You remember that? He was on all fours, and he was, the beast of the field, walking around eating grass. And then that changed. His senses returned to him. And do you know how that came about? Daniel 4:34 says, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. So is it really even possible? Here's my question. Is it really even possible for someone who doesn't fear God to actually be wise? 1 Corinthians 3:18-20 doesn't think so. It says, let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. So a person may claim great scientific wisdom, and they may even be considered the most brilliant in their field. Take Richard Dawkins, whom we've talked about many times. He's considered a high intellectual. He's a professor of philosophy at Oxford. But what does God say about people who don't fear him? They're fools. Now, my point here is not to poke fun at Mr. Dawkins, really. He's a really smart guy. But he's made himself into a bit of a target, because he's always proclaiming how mindless and naive Christian people are for ignoring the science of evolution. But as you'll see today, it's not we who ignore science. It's the likes of Dawkins who ignore the science. And how can I say that? Now think about this for a second. Think with me. If a person who's trying to find truth on anything, a solution, who first cuts themselves off from one of two possibilities, they've effectively cut their chances in half of finding the truth. Isn't that correct? So how wise is it to unilaterally reject one of two possibilities out of hand, even before investigating? Not wise. And this is because wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. So this is what is happening in modern science. In their rush to rid themselves of God, scientists have embraced evolution and refuse to even consider that creation could even remotely be true. And they jump to this conclusion that evolution is fact. But evolution ain't fact. In fact, it's not even technically a theory. Because in scientific reasoning, a theory is supported by at least a modicum of evidence. But the only evidence that you're going to see today is the evidence that evolutionists are trying to foist a scam on us. So, let's start with this. We already went through what are we up against and why otherwise intelligent people believe in evolution. Now let's talk about evolution itself. We need to understand as a foundational issue, we need to distinguish between Darwinian and neo-Darwinian evolution. So Darwinian evolution, classical Darwinian evolution, functions on natural selection alone, or survival of the fittest. It says the stronger of the species survive and pass on their traits, and the weaker ones die off. Darwin believed that over millions of years, weaker organisms died, leaving the stronger ones to pass on their traits. And keep in mind, with Darwin, it had nothing to do with genetics. Why? Because nobody had ever even heard of genetics in Darwin's day. So, neo-Darwinian evolution, on the other hand, starts with spontaneous biogenesis. That is, a living cell emerging from non-living matter. That's the first step. The second step, random gene mutation. So that newly spawned cell that came from a rock or a pebble of sand or whatever, then undergoes random mutation, which causes changes. Now keep in mind this is random. Neo-Darwinian evolution says that all mutations are random, no purpose, no intention, nothing, okay? Because there's no intelligence. And from there, natural selection takes over. If the mutation causes the cell to become weaker, it dies. If it causes to become stronger, then it lives and survives. And it passes on this mutation to the next generation. Now, does everybody get that? That's important that you understand neo-Darwinian evolution, because that's what everyone believes now. And it's on these three fundamental assumptions that neo-Darwinian evolution rises or falls. Now get this, disprove just one and the entire theory falls apart under its own weight. Okay? So here's our logical argument at the bottom. If any of the three bases of neo-Darwinian evolutions are false, it's all false. My assertion, the first two foundations are false. So therefore, neo-Darwinian evolution is false. So you think we can prove this? All right, let's get after it then. Spontaneous biogenesis. Let's start with this one and pick it apart. Also called chemical evolution. It's the idea that under the right conditions, living creatures can emerge from non-living matter. First problem, Louis Pasteur. About the same time that Darwin was formulating his theory in the mid-1800s, Louis Pasteur was busy proving that life comes only from life, period. And he proved it. Now, this experiment was essentially a precursor of what Pasteur's experiment was, but we'll give you the gist of what Pasteur was after. I think it's a little clearer. The idea that non-life can spark life goes back to the 16th century. Scientists were pointing out that if you leave a piece of meat out uncovered, maggots would appear. And this was considered proof that life came from non-life. But Pasteur effectively showed that when meat was shielded from outside factors such as flies, it did not breed maggots. Now, nowadays, everyone knows that maggots are flea larvae, right? I'm sorry, fly larvae. So you see how all this works. There has never, in fact, been a scientific experiment that produced the substances needed for life. But here's the caveat. Ask an evolutionist that, and they'd say, oh, yes, there has been. So what's the catch? Well, in 1953, two scientists conducted what is known as the Miller-Urey experiment. And this experiment tried to say, start with a hypothetical atmosphere of ammonia, water, and methane, add a little energy, and amino acids would be produced. Amino acids, as you might know, are the building blocks of proteins, and proteins are what make up cells. So there are gases swirling around in space, a bolt of lightning, voila, life. Now never mind where the gases came from, where the lightning came from. We'll just skip over that for right now. So what did this experiment really produce? 0.85 alanine, that's an amino acid. 1.05% glycine, that's an amino acid. 13% carbolic acid, toxin. 85% tar, toxin. Trace other neutral stuff. So less than 2% amino acids. Well, you might say, that's a start. But here's the problem. The other 98% are toxic to proteins. Next, let's try to spawn a school of tadpoles in a vat of acid. Okay? It's just not going to happen. And a few of the more astute admitted that. They say, and they were talking about some scientists out there, say, this is ridiculous. They say what Miller-Urey thought might have been the Earth's early atmosphere would have been made formation of proteins impossible. Why? Because it was toxic. But they still believe it. They still teach that in schools as how life was spawned. Don't believe me? Listen to this. Nobel Prize winner George Wald said, spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. So far, so good. Then he says, yet here we are, as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. So I hope it's clear that, at least from what I've said here, now we went into more depth last time, but we're going fast. I hope it's clear that non-life has never been shown to be a viable possibility that life coming from non-life has never really been shown to be a viable possibility yet. And that secular science is hanging its hat on an experiment that has produced nothing of value. So next, random gene mutation. Evolutionists claim that after a living cell emerged from non-living stuff, the cell began mutating. So next we're going to have to talk about genetics a little bit. Don't get scared. I think this is going to be fun. So genetics is the study of how genes and traits are passed down from one generation to the next. Now think about this for a second. Every single day, about 333 billion of the cells in your body die and are replaced with new cells. Now, like we said last time, 330 billion is probably not a big number to a politician, but to us, that's huge. And if it were not for genes, after 10 years, all of those cell replacements would make us look like completely different people. Eric would walk into the room 10 years from now and nobody would know it was Eric. Because the cells would not replicate Eric-looking cells. Worse, his ear might be in the place where his eye was last time you saw him. Because the cell wouldn't know if it was supposed to make an eye cell or an ear cell. This is what genetics does. And it's the reason that our kids tend to look like us in many ways. So how does the body do this? Well, by storing and using information. The cells essentially whip out a set of instructions for reproducing themselves, and then they start building, so they know what to do. So DNA at the very essence is information, but not information in the form of words, it's chemicals, because cells react to chemical information. So DNA in the most basic form is like letters of the alphabet arranged into words. That's DNA. The next step up would be genes, which are sets of DNA, and that's like sentences and paragraphs. And the next step up from that is the genome, which is the whole book. Okay, now does everybody understand that? You are now experts on genetics. Okay? So, when evolutionists, now keep that in mind. So when evolutionists say that over billions of years, one little cell eventually became a human being, do you see what they're really saying? They're saying that the first tiny cell, no brain, no intentions, no design, found a way to generate vast amounts of instructions for making eyes, nerves, skins, bones, muscle, etc. All by accident, by the way. Now, how the first cell developed to begin with is still a question, right? Because life from non-life is questionable at the very best. But we're being magnanimous today, okay? We're going to give them their first fully evolved cell. We're going to say, Mr. Evolutionist, you've got your first cell. Now what? What could possibly add the genetic instructions to transform that one cell into Russ? Evolutionists say gene mutation is responsible, and as we said, DNA is information, language, if you will. So to help understand a mutation, take this sentence. An 18-wheeler is not bearing down at you at 90 miles per hour. Now let's replace one letter in that sentence. An 18-wheeler is now bearing down on you at 90 miles per hour. You just changed one letter. The point? It's very unlikely that a random mistake could improve the meaning of a message. The meaning is probably going to be damaged. One college biology textbook said it like this: a random change is not likely to improve the genome any more than firing a gunshot blindly through the hood of a car is likely to improve engine performance. In fact, things are never improved by making mistakes. A surgeon leaves a stethoscope inside a patient when they sew him up after surgery. Gee, doc, my stomach hurts, but man, I can hear really well. Now, evolutionists admit this problem, but they still think that once in a million years or so, a good mutation would improve the genetic code. So the DNA from a blob of fat actually produced a brain. Hey, now I can think. Wow, I have a leg. 2! What do you know? So that's kind of, sounds ridiculous, but it's really essentially what they are saying is happening. So I hope you can see that, first of all, a rock is never going to evolve into a cell. And secondly, the mutation of the first cell could never have made it stronger. It would have always damaged it. I don't know if you know this, but there has never been a time that it has ever been shown that a mutation has made anything stronger. But that's where Neo-Darwinian evolution leads us. They say the stronger cell survives, and the characteristics that made it stronger are passed on to future generations. Then natural selection takes over. Now, when we studied this in detail, we discussed how evolutionists conflate facts to make it appear that something is true when it's not. And here's one way they do that. There are two kinds of evolution, and one of them is quite legitimate, and that's called adaptation or natural selection. Here's an example. If you were a bird and your food source was insects that live in little tiny holes in wood and rocks, would you like to have a long skinny beak or a big fat one? Under those circumstances, the skinny beaked birds are going to survive and the fat ones are going to go the way of the dodo, right? So that is what is referred to as adaptation or natural selection. The skinny beaked birds are going to naturally be selected to survive. But nothing is evolving here. The fat-beaked birds have the genetics that cause them to produce more fat-beaked birds, right? And the skinny-beaked birds have the genes to produce more skinny-beaked birds. One is just dying off and leaving the other one. One does not evolve into the other. Do you get that? But evolutionists say that this is evidence of evolution. They conflate adaptation with evolution to make you swallow the camel. And they do this by sidestepping this tiny fact that just because creatures can adapt to their environments doesn't tell you how the bird evolved from a rock. But what they're doing is holding a tiny little morsel out in front of you saying, open your mouth and close your eyes, and then you do that and they cram a car down your throat, okay? That's what they're trying to do. So, to bring this back to where we started, Neo-Darwinian evolution is based on the idea that good mutations combined with natural selections are what drive evolution. And this is currently the most widely believed explanation of life's origins. They say it's fact. So here's the obvious question. Has a good mutation ever been observed? Because if the whole theory of Neo-Darwinian evolution rides on whether or not this has ever happened, I think it's a reasonable question, isn't it? Show me just one instance in which a mutation improved the code. Now, one time they asked Richard Dawkins this on national television, and his response said more than anything you would ever have to see. He just sat there and couldn't respond. But I won't go there. Google it. So, Darwin cited a case where flying beetles on a remote island lost their wings over time, and that helped them survive. Here's what happened. The biggest cause of death for these beetles was being blown into the sea by the winds. And so the loss of their wings kept them on the ground, and so they were no longer being blown into the sea. But what about the wingless beetle that comes face to face with Mr. Big Lizard? They become lunch, okay? So the loss of wings is a bad mutation that has overall bad consequences. There was a case where it caused them to survive. And the loss of the ability to fly doesn't help anyone understand how beetles got their wings in the first place. Mutations can take things away, but they can't add things. And that's what is required in evolution. In order to see evolution, we'd have to see a beetle with no wings get wings. That's never happened. The next one, another example evolutionists cite, is this bacterium's ability to become resistant to antibiotics. It was discovered that this resistance came from a bacterium's ability to swap genes. I won't go into that, but it was assumed that this ability evolved after the advent of antibiotics. But when researchers were examining samples of preserved cholera bacteria from 1888, guess what they found? The same swapping ability. And that was in 1927, which was 39 years before the first antibiotic, penicillin. So, what do we have here? Another example of adaptation, not evolution. So I said, if we could disprove any of the three fundamental building blocks of neo-Darwinism, then evolution would fall apart, right? Spontaneous biogenesis, random mutation, natural selection, etc. If any of those are false, the entire theory collapses. So based on the evidence we've discussed, I think any honest person would have to admit that both spontaneous biogenesis and good gene mutation have a long way to go if they're to be taken seriously at the very best, right? I'm being nice. So, the late evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould taught at both Harvard and New York University, and his work is still found in many college textbooks. And that though he was an evolutionist, he wrote that he had been beguiled by the unifying power of neo-Darwinian evolution. But when he studied it as a graduate student, he said the weight of evidence pushed him to the reluctant conclusion that neo-Darwinian evolution as a general principle or proposition is effectively dead, despite its persistence as textbook orthodoxy. He was pretty well known, of course, scoffed at after that. Okay, so we probably haven't bore down too much enough to really get rid of every question you have in your mind, but I hope at least we put a dent in neo-Darwinian evolution. So now let's turn our attention from the macro to the micro, to microbiology and biochemistry. Now, the vast majority of what I'm going to use in this part was taken from Michael Behe's book called Darwin's Black Box. And since I am relying so heavily on him, I want to give him credit. He was a graduate from Drexel University with a BS in chemistry, received his PhD in biochemistry at the University of Pennsylvania in '78 for his dissertation on sickle cell disease. He then did postdoctoral work on DNA structure at the National Institute of Health and was assistant professor of chemistry at Queens College, New York. Since 1985, he's been a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. So, didn't just fall off the turnip truck. Now, I understand from my research that he's not a Christian, and he remains a believer in evolution at some level, but his studies in microbiology and microchemistry led him to the belief that evolution had to have been guided by a intelligent designer. Okay, so at least there's a little bit of reason there. Now, while I would disagree on that point, I'm using his research solely on the basis of his helpfulness in debunking evolution at the scientific level. Now, Psalm 139:14 says, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. And perhaps nowhere else does this become more evident than in microbiology and biochemistry. So, little introduction here. Microbiology and biochemistry are concerned with life functions at the molecular and chemical level, where DNA is studied. Now remember that the microscope, the research that was done with microscopes wasn't really possible until about 1931, when a German scientist named Max Knoll created the first scanning electron microscope. And that's when the theory of evolution began to face its real challenges. So how is evolution challenged by microbiology? Now think about this. Charles Darwin died in 1882, and the electron microscope was invented in 1931. So Darwin, looking through the average late 1800s microscope, would have observed cells as nothing more than big blobs, or little tiny blobs, excuse me. So Darwin couldn't say how a cell might have evolved. He was essentially guessing based on merely what he could see. And here's what he saw. On the one hand, you had many variations in species, and some big were some were small, some were fast, some were slow, one brown, one white, and so forth. And on the other hand, he saw limited food supplies. Not all organisms could survive, only the ones that got the food. So, let's face it, in a battle between these two, which one's going to win? Never mind the fact that both of them are still around. So those with the variations that gave them an advantage would survive, and the others would die off. And that variation that gave them the advantage would then be passed on to future generations, right? But Darwin thought the organism would change over time because of these variations being passed on. And over great periods of time, large changes would occur. So he was looking at appearance alone. But the real work of biology doesn't happen on appearance alone. It happens at the molecular level. But he couldn't see cells, much less molecules. Scientists of his era looked at the cell as some type of piece of microscopic jello. And the cold hard fact is that the modern microbiologist and microchemist admit that if evolution is true, it could not have happened the way Darwin laid it out. Why? Irreducible complexity. What is irreducible complexity? Well, Michael Behe coined that term in his book, Darwin's Black Box. And it all boils down to this. The mousetrap is an example of a system that is irreducibly complex. Why? Because you can't take away any of the parts of a mousetrap and still expect it to catch a mouse. It's a simple machine. It's a bunch of parts that all work together towards one end, catching a mouse. Remove any part and Mr. Mouse is free to move about your home. Now, irreducible complexity means that every part of the system is needed for it to function properly. In other words, you can't simplify an irreducibly complex system without loss of function. Does everybody get that? Well, when microbiologists started to look inside cells, when they got those big microscopes, it became more and more apparent that what they were seeing were very tiny but sophisticated machines, which were incredibly complex. And here's where that complicates things for our evolutionist friends. If a cell needs all of its fully evolved parts to function, then how did it manage to survive before it was evolved? Stated another way, how can a single cell organism get to its state of functioning when the loss of any of its parts would kill it? So many molecular systems inside cells are irreducible, and Dr. Behe became well known for his research on one of them, the flagellum of an E. coli bacteria. Behe argued that the flagellum could not have possibly evolved, and I'm going to refer to this drawing while I read his comments. Just take a look while I read this. These are his words. The flagellum can be thought of as an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It consists of a long tail that acts as a propeller. When it is spun, it pushes against the liquid, which propels the bacterium forward. The propeller is attached to a drive shaft through the hook region, which acts as a universal joint. The drive shaft is attached to the motor, which uses a flow of acid and sodium ions to power rotation. Just as an outboard motor has to be kept stationary on a motorboat while the propeller turns, proteins, which act as a stator structure, keep the flagellum in place. Other proteins act as bushings to prevent the drive shaft to pass through the bacterial membrane. Studies have shown that 30 to 40 proteins are required to produce a single functioning flagellum. About half of the proteins are components of the flagellum, while the others are necessary for its construction. In the absence of almost any of the proteins, in the absence of the parts that act as the propeller, drive shaft, etc., no functioning flagellum can be built. Now that's just one example. The cells in our bodies are teeming with machines like these. Molecular machines that haul cargo. Molecular machines that make up the highways on which the cargo is hauled. Molecules act as cables, ropes, pulleys, holding cells in shape. Molecular machines turn switches on and off. Solar-powered machines capture the energy of photons and store it in chemicals. Molecular machines allow electricity to flow through nerves. Manufacturing machines build other machines. Manufacturing machines rebuild themselves. Cells copy themselves with machinery, and cells ingest food with machinery. So you're seeing how complicated this all is. Sophisticated machines control every process. So the big question here, can evolution create this stuff? The media reports on this stuff. This guy discovered this, and this is where it's going to go, and this is when it's going to prove. And you know, it's always breathless, right? They're always like, this just in. But when it comes right down to it, do evolutionist scientists have any answers for irreducible complexity? Not really. Scientists like biochemist Russell Doolittle and University of Delaware professor John McDonald have argued against Behe when it comes to irreducible complexity. In fact, McDonald went to the extent of creating an online flash presentation to show that the mousetrap is not irreducibly complex. But he misses the point at two fundamental levels. First of all, atheists like McDonald's say that the cell evolved, not devolved. What McDonald was doing was taking this apart little by little, intricately, and trying to make it still function. But he was missing the point. They were saying it evolved. Secondly, the deconstructed mousetrap does not address the fact that the removal of any one part of the original mousetrap would disable it without intervening intelligence. Now think about this. McDonald, as he was devolving this mousetrap, was using a lot of brain power. And yet, he would be the first to claim that it was constructed by chance. No intelligence. Charles Darwin himself said this: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. That's from The Origin of Species. So the conundrum for evolutionists is significant here. But they've made it worse on themselves. How? Well, pardon the word, but it's just stupid enough to say that incredibly complex systems inside cells created themselves over millions of years, but it's stupider to say that the whole process was unguided and purely random. Again, I'm going to read Dr. Behe. Second, a more subtle problem is how the parts assemble themselves into the whole. The analogy of the outboard motor fails in one respect. An outboard motor is built under the direction of a human, an intelligent agent who can specify which parts are attached to which other parts. The information for assembling a bacteria flagellum, however, is in the structure itself. Recent work shows that the assembly process for a flagellum is exceedingly elegant and intricate. If that assembly information is absent from the proteins, then no flagellum can be produced. Thus, even if we had a hypothetical cell in which all the parts of the flagellum were present, but we were missing the information on how to assemble themselves into flagellum, we would still not get the structure. The problem of irreducible complexity would still remain. So, what is he saying here? It's like a model car. When you buy a model, think of that box as a cell. When you buy that model, all the parts are in the box, hopefully. I know that many times I got into it and said, that one doesn't seem to be there. You know, I found it at some point, but also the instructions for building it are inside that box. So what's the point? If you were not quite bright enough to deduce that someone designed those parts, I think that set of instructions might just give you a hint that somebody designed it. because those instructions demonstrate that the parts were created by an intelligent designer. So in the same way, the bacterial flagellum contains within itself the instructions for not only operating itself, but for replicating itself. And that's intelligence, folks. And I may add, intelligence with a purpose. And that's really the catch for the atheist, right? Because you can't admit to purpose or design. Why? Because that is tacit admission to intelligence. In short, they would have to admit to God. So let's break down the difference between what happens in real life every day compared to what evolutionists are trying to tell us. If you wanted to create something, let's say something that would carry you under your own propulsion, you take a board, fasten 4 wheels to it, and voila, you have a skateboard. And that's how it happens in real life. A creator thinks about something they want to accomplish, and then they build something to accomplish that purpose. So you have creator, purpose, concept, and then invention. And only when the skateboard is complete can it accomplish its intended purpose. Now here's what the atheists say. The board evolved from nothing and for no reason. Over millions and millions of years, it then developed a wheel, and then 2, then 3, and then 4. In the end, this thing with a deck and 4 wheels can be used to transport a person, even though that was not the intent. Why? Because there is no intent at all. The skateboard happened by accident, and the fact that I can ride it is mere coincidence. Well, we've spent some time debunking evolution today, and I hope that you've seen that evolution ain't a fact, it ain't a theory, and it ain't even a well-developed hypothesis. Evolution is nothing more than a vain attempt to dispose of a creator. It's a lie that attacks the very foundation of the gospel, which is the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And here's the verse that tells us what they are trying to do. Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Now in the coming weeks, maybe week or weeks, we will again look at the evidence and reliability of Scripture and the truth of Jesus Christ. And then we will be on to, hopefully, world religions, which will be fun. Heavenly Father, I've said it many times, but I'll say it again. Thank you so much for being a God that just didn't put us on this earth and say, believe what I say because I say it. Lord, you have given us the ability to reason. You've given us the ability to see evidence, and you've put the evidence everywhere. And Lord, we thank you that you have given us the ability to see the truth, because we know that if we didn't have that ability from you, we would be groping in the dark like all these others. And Lord, thank you. Help us never to become prideful, because we know that it's only because of your grace that we believe what we believe and that we know you. Lord, help us today to worship you in spirit and in truth. May we go into church today and be prepared to worship you, to be prepared to hear your word, and then be prepared to walk out and do what you say. And Lord, thank you so much for our church, and we ask that you would bless every aspect of the service today. In Jesus' name, amen.